This session was born out of the realization that really anyone in this room could be a keynote or a plenary as part of this conference, and that we're not getting to hear from everyone, so we wanted to get at least a few more voices into the mix before we left. And also that values of leadership are a really important part of the work that we do here, because we're not making widgets or cars, we're doing work that requires, well, not that that doesn't require leadership doing the car, I have no idea, but we're doing work that requires kind of something really from within, and we wanted to have at least one session that talked about that. So we brought three wonderful people who will be talking about different variations on that theme, and we'll do it in an interview format. So we'll start with Carrie, and then Petra, and then Dr. Jempa, and that is all. So I'll go ahead and get started with Carrie Anthony. By way of introduction, Carrie Anthony is the Chief Executive of DePaul Ireland, which is the Ireland affiliate of DePaul International, which we've heard a little bit about from Mark Grady. She has also been working in the field of homelessness for 18 years in London, Glasgow, Dublin, and Belfast, prior to becoming director of DePaul Ireland in 2007. And important to the conversation that we'll have here, DePaul Ireland was the first to do wet accommodation in Ireland, which is also known as harm reduction or accommodation for people who are actively drinking, depending on the language that you're familiar with. So we wanted to talk to her a little bit about how she did that and what that was like. So Carrie, thank you for joining us. And the first question is, so DePaul Ireland, in order to do this wet accommodation, essentially had to change the service strategy and the status quo in some ways of what was acceptable and what was done. What challenges did you encounter in doing that?
I think for us there were probably two main challenges around introducing the concept of harm reduction or low threshold services, as we would call them, into Ireland. There definitely have been an acceptance by our commissioning bodies, by the statutory sector, that there was a need for these services. Drawing on experience from elsewhere, I give Jeremy some credit again in terms of what Thames Reach and other organisations have been doing in London and elsewhere. But I think the two main challenges for us really were within the sector, the not-for-profit community and voluntary sector itself, and also then within the wider community. So within the sector there was some, I suppose, cultural shifts that had to happen around introducing wet services. When I had worked in Dublin previously for the health board at that time, it was incredibly difficult to get people who were what I would have considered the most in need of services into services, because they were known to be active drug users or active drinkers, so it was very difficult to get them into services, which in my mind, being a frontline worker at that point in time, made no sense whatsoever, because surely they were the people who most needed the services. And I think Louise mentioned yesterday about how at times we have geared services to meet the needs maybe of ourselves as professionals rather than of the people that we're really there to serve. So there was a cultural shift, I think, needed within the sector around the concept of low threshold and harm reduction services, although that had been, I think, accepted by the statutory funders, because we could see very visibly people still going round and round and round the system and quite often sleeping rough. I think then the next major challenge for us was around community relations. Harm reduction services aren't always considered best practice by everybody. Some people don't agree with it. There's very much an ideological difference between abstinence-based services and harm reduction-based services, but for me this was very much a pragmatic decision that we took in Ireland and in Northern Ireland to find a way to get people into services and keep them in services. So we faced challenges in terms of local community campaigns against us. People will be aware of the phrase NIMBYism, not in my backyard, and that was a very, very strong feature of trying, and still, I was saying to Kat yesterday, just last summer, I was in Derry talking about opening a service like this in Derry, and there was a really concerted campaign from the local politicians who had told me outside of the room that they would support it, but inside of the room with 200 people in the room who wouldn't let me speak, they didn't support it. So there was a lot of work to do around that. Also, there were media campaigns at times against these types of services, so again, a lot of work to do around educating people about what the services were. So the actual delivery of the service themselves has its own challenges, but getting them up and running and accepted as part of the overall offering to people was definitely challenging.
And how did you overcome some of those challenges?
Well, I think we talked, we talk in DePaul a lot about values, and so Vincent DePaul, where some of our inspiration comes from, Mark talks regularly about being firm on the goals and flexible in the means, and that's what Vincent DePaul, who was probably the ultimate pragmatist, took his approach. So I think we knew what we wanted to achieve, but in terms of achieving it, we had to be quite flexible in our way of going around that. So I think for us, obviously it was about engaging with the sector, because we were never going to be able to deliver these services on our own. I think you have to accept as an organisation what your own limitations are, and make sure you work collaboratively with others to support the work that you're trying to do. So that was a big part of it. Also, opening up our services and bringing people in to understand that what we weren't doing was harm observation. So for us, it wasn't just about allowing people to drink to the point that they got completely full and we watched them die. It really was about how do we engage people to start thinking differently about how they use alcohol. So we developed our own internal approach, alcohol management plan approach that we have within the organisation. So each individual who comes into our service has to have an alcohol management plan in place, and that's very much about reducing harm. So I think people have this mythical idea of what a wet service would look like, and when you bring them in, it's a very, very different opinion. So in one of our services, we had an ongoing campaign from a local newspaper, and every week or month I would get a phone call about some incident that happened, and I would give some inane response along the lines of, we don't comment on individual cases, blah, but we're a good neighbourhood, blah, blah, blah. And eventually I thought, right, enough's enough, so we invited the newspaper in. So, after 3 years of a campaign against us, they then wrote a very, very different story, because they began to understand what the service was about, what we were trying to achieve, and started to work with us. I think probably in terms of the local community, it was for us setting up processes and systems where people could be heard. And also I think at times, like the dairy incident that I was speaking about, actually when I listened to the community of 200 people, they had a point. And actually, I think we had to accept they had a point and say, yes, we still need this service, but not here, I understand it. And I think there is something about working with people to know when they have a point and accept that you need to be flexible again, so still firm in the goal that we need that service, but flexible about how we're going to get that there. And I think, obviously, in terms of overcoming our challenges, our biggest asset are the people who work in our services. We've 20 plus services now in Ireland, and obviously for myself I can be everywhere at once, so we've got leaders within our projects who are really leading around the values of our organisation, and very much about engaging and working collaboratively with other people. So in terms of trying to overcome challenges, sure there's challenges every day, but I think it's encouraging people's resilience to be able to deal with those and keep focused on what we're trying to do for the people who come to us for support.
And last question, now that you've succeeded with that project, what's next?
Again, I think for us it's like never, I think there's been lots of themes that have come out at the conference. It's never resting on your laurels, and it's never accepting that you've finished what you started. So for example, if I take our Stella Maris project in Belfast, our statutory funders would tell us that it's an exemplar project, we don't need to change it, it's fantastic. But Stella Maris is 10 years old in September this year. And in my mind, you don't just keep running a service and saying it's great, it's grand, you have to stop and evaluate. So around about 7 years ago, I was having this debate with our statutory funders, and it's very nice of you to say that the project's fantastic, but I think we can do more. So for us then it was about introducing Housing First into Northern Ireland and taking that chaotic drinker and providing a home for them, and doing that in a very much a collaborative way, so working with others. So, and again, another project that we ran, which was for IV drug users in Dublin again, it was great at the time that we opened it, it was a night shelter, but 10 years later, that wasn't, I don't think, the best model that we could have moving forward. So I think we're not, if we haven't succeeded, we're not done, so we're always trying to think about how we can improve in our practice.
Thank you, Carrie. Okay. And now we have Petra give breath, and I'll tell you a little bit about Petra before I start to grill her. I don't know if that's an American term, but ask her a question. So Petra is a lecturer at Monash University in Malaysia. Before this, she also worked at various organizations involved with refugee families, sexual health, street youth, and women's rights. So she's been in the classroom, but also working a lot on the ground in different contexts in Malaysia. So that's Petra's background. And Petra, I actually want to ask you a question about values. So first, is there a value that guides your work on homelessness, or that you think should guide work on homelessness generally?
Should guide my work. I think humility is quite important, especially in terms of trying to listen to the community. Because where we are at the moment in Malaysia is that the community that we're working with, the homeless community, is pretty much quite unorganized, and there tends to be quite a top-down approach to things, where a lot of the recommendations come either from authorities who are operating within a government capacity, or a lot of expertise being sought either from academics, quite doubtful here, and also from non-profit NGO workers who may have their own challenges in trying to relate to and understand the community as well.
And where does your belief in, or your emphasis on humility come from for you?
It's a lot more personal. So my family background, we were raised Catholic, but because of my mom, we practice a lot of Buddhist meditation as well. Which means that mystical, contemplative, spiritual practices were quite big for my mum and I, especially in handling human rights work and coping with some of the stresses that tend to come with being someone who operates on the ground. So in spite of this sort of religious background, my main mentor, particularly when I was starting out in human rights work, happened to be a Muslim human rights lawyer. And he was a bit of a Sufi, also quite spiritual, contemplative, in his own practices as well. And what he said, which just really, really hit home and contextualized so much of what I was raised to do as well, and especially by my mom, was that he talked about how the work we do isn't about the ego or who we are, but the work that we do basically all has to do with us being a vessel. So what I needed to do, and I think I was very lucky to have met him very early on in my early 20s, was to basically empty myself, and just be a vessel for something else to channel through me in order to do this kind of work. So when I started working with homeless communities, especially with adults, again, not too long ago, that basically came back to me, where you have to question yourself, at least for me, I needed to question myself, like, okay, am I coming into this, to project myself as being an academic expert? Am I here, to put myself out, as someone who could speak authoritatively and perhaps negotiate? This is maybe very idealistic here with government authorities. Like, where do I stand in relation to this community who basically have provided foundation and backbone upon which I base my credibility on? And to me, it just came back to that old lesson that my mentor taught me so many years ago, which was, what you're supposed to do is to empty yourself and be a vessel. And what this means, is constantly reminding yourself, how you are not the expert in spite of how people might set you up to be. But, like, rather, being a vessel so that you can hopefully channel what the community has to say as accurately as possible. Which is very much necessary at the moment, because I think we are still not at that level where we respect lived experiences as much as we should. So being an advocate for me is quite a complicated relationship, because on the one hand it's very easy to be swept up by your role as an advocate, and as an expert, given that there's so few people doing this kind of work. But on the other hand, what you know is nothing compared to that lived experience, which only someone who belongs to the community can describe.
And last question for you: why is it important specifically to work on homelessness or to finding solutions for homelessness?
So how I try and juggle my work at the moment is I split my time as a teacher at a university, and that's very fulfilling because it gives you that opportunity to take a step back and constantly contemplate, well, what's the context within which this kind of work is taking place. But at the same time, I try and keep up with my volunteer work within the community. So I told a couple of people here that my students know if they can't get consultations with me on particular days, they usually know that I'm at a hospital bringing a client, and I know that client is probably the wrong word to use. I can't think of a better term at the moment, but basically someone from the community who needs to basically go to the hospital. So I'm very lucky to be able to stand in two worlds consecutively, at the moment. And what happened last year was, so in Malaysia, and just to give you a bit of context, we are a Muslim majority country, and Ramadan, which is our fasting month, is very big. All right, and usually that's when you get a lot of restaurants and individuals donating food, particularly to people who are in need of food, in the streets. So it's during festival periods, whether it's Christmas, Chinese New Year, well, maybe not so much Chinese New Year, but Ramadan, as well, that you would find a lot of food aid going out. And for whatever reason, government authorities, primarily people who are attached to the local council of the capital city of Kuala Lumpur, and alarmingly enough as well, persons as well who are attached, to welfare, and the ministry that was in charge of welfare, they came down quite strongly on soup kitchen volunteers, saying that those who were found to be distributing food aid during the period, this particular period, would be either fined or arrested. And so that was quite amazing, especially since this was announced during Ramadan month, when a lot of people, particularly Muslims, would altruistically provide food aid. And but in a way, I think it was actually a good thing, because it started a conversation going. You basically had people speaking up very passionately about the work that they've been doing as volunteers for quite a long time. You also have people who otherwise perhaps might have sidelined the community quite easily, starting to see that, well, this not only impacts the community, but it also impacts people who I can relate to. All right, especially people who are operating as volunteers. So in that sense, it was good, that it made the issue prominent, in that way. But what we've actually seen happening since was, given that it caused a public uproar, it basically encouraged the authorities to get in touch with organizations and individuals who are working on issues of homelessness to see where things could actually move forward. What was interesting to see was that how the authorities looked at it was that, one, they couched it as an issue of public hygiene. And also, an issue of, well, how do we look to tourists who are coming in, and this is their impression of what our country is, where you've got people, living on the streets. But what basically hit, like most of us, was that when the ban upon giving food aid, was announced, primarily it was because our authorities couched the homeless communities as being lazy. So how they understood it was, if you provide food aid, this meant that you were providing an opportunity to homeless persons, to be lazy. So I think, coming back, to that idea, of being a vessel. Now that at this stage, where we have organizations and individuals who are able, to talk to persons of authority within government to see what could be done, and I'm very realistic about how this could be a process that could take years before we even see something take to fruition. I think it's important to keep reminding myself, and hopefully my colleagues and I as well, for all of us involved, to remember that we're simply just vessels, all right, within our capacity as advocates for the homeless community. That's for one, because the homeless community is very much unorganized. But at the same time, and it's something that's an ongoing challenge and battle, I think for my context at least, we need to keep advocating for the need to also involve people with lived experiences, to come to the table and actually be advocates. So it's a call for myself, given that for the longest time when I was working for various NGOs, you always see yourself as an advocate. And now I'm having to question my kind of approach, and wonder, well, should I actually put that aside and rather think of myself as being more of a facilitator, all right, to actually open up, and provide and work with authorities to provide that space, trusting that communities are perfectly well of advocating for their own. It's quite poignant for me as well, because when I think about many of my clients, many of whom were underage, or just over the age of 18. They went through challenges that I could only imagine, and they survived things, that I couldn't imagine myself or people quite close to me surviving. So perhaps, it's also, my own quest to see how I can humble myself, by trusting that if they can survive so much more, than what I can imagine myself experiencing, then perhaps, the challenge of being an advocate is very different from what I originally envisioned for myself when I started out in this work.
Thank you, Petra.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask Dr. Petra to come to the stage. So by way of introduction, Dr. Petra is the founder of the Institute for Urban Workers, as well as the Burhan Social Development Training and Consultation Center in Addis Ababa. She has her Master of Philosophy from the University of Manchester, and in addition to publishing several books, Dr. Jumba spent 5 years as a political prisoner during the military regime during the 1970s, where she ran a clinic in the prison and helped deliver 12 children while she was there. She's now working, I'm skipping actually a lot of her bio because there's quite a lot there, but she's now working to set up 3 projects in urban slums in Addis Ababa. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Jumba. So we went through a little of your background, but I'm wondering if you can tell us briefly about some of the work you're doing now with people who are going through homelessness and on housing.
So I said, became aware that the city council has officially announced that there were 100,000 homeless in our complex. Eviction is one of the reasons. Poverty, again, old age, disability, so on. So the survey indicates, we did a sample survey in the city. There are people who actually sleep just under the sky, with no shelter whatsoever in any shed. And during the rainy season, it's very disturbing to see how that is bad. While the slum area housing, at least they have a space of their own, they do something in the world still in condition. So from organized area specific to trying to get into homelessness citywide to try and address that if possible.
And what is it that gets you out of bed in the morning that gives you what you need to go day after day and do this work?
Right from childhood, I practice in Brisbane. At the age of 12, really, I was called to work before. So I always felt my duty is to actually do something about poverty alleviation. And I've done it in different shapes in childhood, under my health discipline, as well as social, economics, and theology. So it really is, I feel what we are doing is a drop in an ocean, considering the level of poverty there is. So now we've gone to setting up a college. Our offices were demolished and the land was sold to some relative. So we stopped going from one area to the other slum areas. We're now focusing on turning the disciples who will follow the same trend in poverty alleviation and social justice. So we are now focusing on by making them on this syndrome as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jumba.